4:01. The first agenda item was a confirmation of quorum, and we just had that, but I was waiting an extra minute or so to see if there'd be anybody else joining in. Again, I want to really say I really appreciate everyone's time on this committee, in your participation of the committee members and the staff. We've had really good participation on a weekly basis, and we've been meeting before the holidays. And so it's a huge commitment on your part, and it's so much appreciated by everybody in your time. And so with that, I'd like to move down. I'd like to go back to Miss Anderson concerning the water services plant tour. There was a survey done out, or at least an email question, if there was an interest. I know from talking with Miss Anderson last week, there was a pretty good fair amount of interest in doing the tour. And so I'd like to hand it over to Miss Anderson.
Thanks, Chair Odegaard. I'm going to leave my camera off because I've been having some difficulty with Teams, and so hopefully this will allow me to come across okay verbally. If at any point you can't hear me, please just let me know. I have restarted my computer, so hopefully that will help. So I did check in with Jim, who's also on the line, and what we had talked about was providing 2 different dates for the tour of the plants. Given that the Rio de Flag and Wildcat are on separate properties, we thought doing them on separate dates would be helpful. The time that we had talked about was maybe March 17th or March 24th. Jim, if you can confirm that those dates work okay with water services.
Yeah, those dates will be fine.
So again, it would be staying with your Thursday timeframes, and we would start the tour at 4 p.m. at those specific locations.
And again, Miss Anderson, make sure I have this correct. On the 17th, we would tour one plant, and then another day on the 24th, we would tour the other plant?
Correct.
Okay. And so I guess now, I guess we need comment from the committee members. If they find those dates work, again, it's so much appreciated that at 4 o'clock every Thursday we meeting. And I know there was some interest among the committee members for these tours. And so I guess I'd like to hear from the committee as a whole. How does that sound? And either a raise hand or even can put it in the chat box will work too.
So Chair Odegaard, I do see that a couple folks are going to be out of town on March 17th or busy because it is spring break. Jim, would it be possible for us to push back, maybe do one on the 24th and another one on the 31st?
Yeah, that'll be fine.
And a question from one of our committee members, from Mr. Kerr, is would these tours replace our regular Teams meeting? And I believe so, if Ms. Anderson want to correct that.
Yes, you're accurate.
Okay, thank you.
And just so everybody knows, the tours will take about an hour and then questions.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I just want to make a comment concerning the tours of the city facilities. I've been on those tours actually a couple times, one as a water commission member, and I find it extremely helpful, especially when I was on the water commission. And I also did another follow-up tour once was I elected, doing a tour of city facilities, and it really gives you a good perspective. You know, what do these facilities do, and the importance of these facilities, and so from the committee, I know we just kicked out the 17th. So how does other two last Thursdays in March work out for everybody? So from what I've seen so far, I've had a couple comments from Vice Chair White says these tour is extremely important. It does give you a lot of information, a lot of background. I see it from one of our committee members, Mr. Byer. He said he's toured in the past and found it very useful. And it looks like Miss Anderson, looks like the 24th and the 31st is going to work. And so I think let's make it a go of it. And those that can, and we'd had from committee member Miss James said the 24th is a conflict, but she could make the 31st. And so maybe as a suggestion to city staff, maybe the tour on the 31st, make that the one that might be the most important or relevant from the discussions that we've had, if we kind of had to put in an order. Does that sound good to you, Miss Anderson?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Chair Odegaard.
Okay, and I see Jim has his hand raised.
So Shannon, let's plan for the Rio on the 24th and Wildcat on the 31st.
Okay, sounds terrific.
Sorry about that. I'm just reading from one of our committee members am I right as of now that we just have meetings scheduled through March 3rd? Yes, and these are all just presentations at this point. And then before our meeting at 4 o'clock, we just kind of had that discussion with Mr. White, our vice chair, about what's going to happen after March 3rd. And maybe now that we've got the tours down, and before we start the presentation, maybe Miss Anderson, you can kind of give us a little idea of maybe what's going to happen March 3rd, other than we already know we're going to have those tour dates the last 2 Thursdays in March. And I assume with the 17th, a lot of people are going to be gone. I assume we're just going to take that day off. And then I guess there'll be one Thursday in between March 3rd and that Thursday that we're going to have off.
Yes, Chair Odegaard, at least based on what we've been talking about thus far, I believe that meeting on March 10th, it would be very helpful if we could talk about the community survey, revisit our timeline, talk about deliberations of this committee, what that will look like in preparation for the recommendation to go to City Council on June 7th. So my hope is that we could use that meeting on the 10th. If there weren't any other questions that committee members had to really talk about what comes next.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Miss Anderson. So with that, we're going to move along. Next agenda item is a climate action presentation. And I'm going to start off with Mr. Clifton. He has his hand raised, and I always like to let Mr. Clifton do introductions. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Odegaard. Good to have everybody here once again. And I am here to do a quick introduction. Nicole Antonopoulos heads up our sustainability section. I emphasize section because a year or so ago, it was just a program. Actually, it was more than a year ago. It was a program that resided in our Public Works division, which was great. But in an effort to see the program elevated both within the organization and I think within its prominence within the community, it became a section and now resides under the manager's office. And I will share with the group that there may be effort to see it become a standalone division as well. We are having those discussions. With that said, Nicole Antonopoulos has been at the helm throughout. She's going to be leading the discussion today. And Nicole, I will ask that you present your colleagues real fast to the group before you present. And I also understand you're having some challenges with Teams. So maybe we just do video introductions, which I'm not doing, but if you don't mind, and then you can turn the videos off and hopefully enjoy better bandwidth. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, Citizen Bond Committee. It is truly an honor. I am getting a note that I might actually have a frozen screen, but hopefully you can at least see Jenny and Ramon. I am absolutely honored to be here with them today. Jenny Neiman is our climate manager, and Ramon Alatorre is our climate and energy analyst. And truly honored, as I mentioned, to be here with them today, but also to be with the Citizen Bond Committee. Great. So may we go ahead and get started, and hopefully my bandwidth will improve, but at least my audio seems to be going through. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I believe we will be pulling up the presentation. Jenny Neiman has agreed to be the conductor, and that should be loading here momentarily. And Greg, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. It is truly just serving in this capacity as the city sustainability director is a pleasure, and I'm really pleased to be here to present the climate action bond proposal for your consideration this afternoon. And I just want to confirm that the presentation is showing. I don't see anything on my screen.
We are seeing it. Yes.
You are. Fantastic. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. So for today's agenda, our presentation will include a brief recap of how we got here to have this conversation with you all, a discussion on climate action, a recap of the carbon neutrality plan, and then the climate action bond proposal itself. My intention for this framework is to provide you with enough background information and context so that the structure of the bond proposal is clear and logical. Next slide. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the full climate team, which is made up of Jenna Ortega, who is our climate engagement coordinator, Jenny Neiman, already introduced, myself, and although I do not spend all of my time on climate action, I do spend most of my time on climate action, and of course, Ramon Alatorre. This afternoon, I will be sharing the presentation stage with both Jenny and Ramon. Next slide. So diving in, I want to talk about how we got here today. Let's begin with a brief review of temperature data points that are informing us of how the climate is changing in Flagstaff. While it is normal to have variability in annual average temperature from year to year, looking at this graph, the blue bars are colder temperatures while the orange bars are warmer. This graph illustrates that from 1985 to 2017, all but 7 of those years had annual average temperatures above the long-term average. We can also extract from this graph that the minimum temperatures are driving this warming trend. So our nights, not last night though, are getting warmer, and we are experiencing fewer days annually with sub-freezing temperatures. Next slide. So how will these temperature shifts impact us? Well, increasingly warmer temperatures will lead to drier conditions. We will continue to see changes in snowpack, which has implications for both stream flow timing and visitation. We will continue to see more intense storms, specifically rainstorms, which will increase flooding potential. There will be increased risk of wildfire due to drought conditions and insect outbreaks. And as Neil Chapman, the city's wildland forest health supervisor states, there no longer is a fire season. It's year round. And some of the committee members may recall that we had forest fires in December of 2020. So overall, by the year 2050, Flagstaff's future climate is projected to resemble that of Prescott's, including the distribution of flora and fauna and growing season length. Next slide. With this changing climate comes vulnerability and risk. This is the foundation for our discussion today because climate change is and will have major impacts on people living in and around Flagstaff, as well as our visitors and our businesses. I'm only going to highlight some key vulnerabilities that we identified through our climate action and adaptation plan development, as well as our carbon neutrality plan development. Those vulnerabilities include our economy, our water supply, our water quality, as well as our water infrastructure, our land use, our housing availability, and public health. All this to say that with strategic preparation for these shifts, we can be better adapted to absorb these shocks associated with climate change. Next slide. While we consider these impacts, we need to keep at the forefront that not all people face the same threats and vulnerabilities to climate change. They vary based on an individual's age, their health conditions, their income, their race, their physical ability, and even where they live. Next slide. For those committee members that are not familiar with the Sustainability Office or the city's growing commitment to climate action, I want to take just a moment to offer a snapshot of the evolution of this work. While our office is minimal and operating with a limited budget, we have been providing climate-related programs to the community since 2007. The most important date on this slide is 2017, when sustainability staff were directed by the City Council to draft our first community-wide climate action plan. That was formally adopted in the year 2018. And from there, well, we shifted into high gear. Next slide. As I mentioned, the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan was adopted in November. The following September, a global climate strike was organized to catalyze global and local climate action. Here in Flagstaff, more than 1,800 community members gathered on the south lawn of City Hall to show their support for increased climate action. At the same time, they were collecting signatures on a petition to ask the City Council to declare a climate emergency declaration. And in January of 2020, hundreds of well-organized community members spoke at the City Council meeting, making the case for the climate emergency declaration. Council directed community members to draft the climate emergency declaration resolution, which was brought forward that June and adopted by City Council unanimously. Next slide. The foundation of the citizen-initiated climate emergency declaration is to accelerate sustained and meaningful climate action by all levels of government, and for people to engage with the challenge of avoiding catastrophic climate change and restore a safe climate by achieving carbon neutrality by the year 2030. Next slide. Carbon neutrality can be achievable if we have leadership, widespread and transformative action, continuity in decision-making, improvement of existing systems and policies, a constantly evolving framework for action, and sustained investment. With that, committee members, I'd like to hand off the presentation to Ramon Alatorre. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to the members of the committee. Next slide, please. So in the next handful of slides, my intention is to give voice to why the community came forth to say that achieving carbon neutrality is a necessity. Doing so will require that I spend a few minutes on definitions, as well as a few minutes unpacking the implication of just one summary graph from the International Panel on Climate Change. I do promise to keep it at a high level because this is not the venue for a comprehensive seminar on a nearly 4,000-page report. But the resolution brought forth by the community is rooted in science literacy. The community members that brought forth and signed the resolution have read the reports, or at least their summaries, and they understand that this is the critical decade for action. If we miss this window, the goal of climate stabilization and reducing harm may well become unattainable. I will also offer the observation that when reviewing climate plans and carbon neutrality plans of other cities, they are all essentially the same. They may be repackaged or reframed some, but at a high level, there is only one path or recipe to achieving carbon neutrality, and it starts with making significant emissions reductions, which just so happens to also have a very well-known recipe. Next slide, please. So our community emissions come from specific sectors and activities, and therefore we must address those sectors and activities. The recipe for achieving deep reductions is relatively straightforward, and thanks to the mantra reduce, reuse, recycle, it is one that we are all familiar with. First, we must reduce, and then whatever can't be reduced must be made cleaner. That's why reduce, reuse, recycle is said in that order, because it is the order of relative importance. So whether talking about buildings, transportation, or consumption, we must first reduce. Then recognizing that there will still be energy used to heat and cool buildings, to transport people and things, to feed and otherwise provide goods to people. The second step is to make sure that the remaining energy that is still consumed in all of these activities is as clean as possible. That's it. That is the general recipe, and it is rather prescriptive. First, use less. Second, use clean. These are the same approaches being used by cities around the world. And while this is a well-known recipe for achieving reductions, carbon neutrality does have an extra ingredient, carbon dioxide removal, which both myself and Jenny Neiman will discuss at a very high level in some of the slides that follow. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the next handful of slides is to quickly familiarize the bond committee with some of the constructs that appear in the carbon neutrality plan, and to help give a sense of magnitude of the emissions reductions that we're striving to achieve in the next 8 short years. The first construct is often referred to as the wedge, and I'll take a moment to verbally build it for you now. If you see this black line, it represents the forecast emissions or pollution that would be generated by our community without taking any climate action. This is known as the business as usual scenario. As you can see, without action, our community emissions are expected to go up over time as our population grows, as our buildings consume more energy, as we drive more miles, consume more, and create more waste. We have observed this increasing trend over the past decades, and we expect it to continue unless action is taken to disrupt it. With a business as usual forecast of nearly 850,000 metric tons in 2030, it would require a mature forest nearly 25 times the size of Flagstaff's footprint to remove all of the pollution that we would generate in the year. This is simply not sustainable long term. Next slide, please. In order to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030, the goal then that was asked for by the community and adopted unanimously by council, we have to bend our net emissions zero curve to zero. Next slide, please. This difference between the business as usual forecast and zero is known as the emissions gap. Our task then is to develop a portfolio of emissions reductions projects to fill this gap, which is exactly what is done here in the classic wedge diagram that is published in the carbon neutrality plan, as well as carbon neutrality plans around the city, or around the world rather. The 7 upper wedges with textured fill represent the reductions that are anticipated with climate action. These would come from our discussed recipe for reductions, first using less and second using cleaner. When we look at our buildings, we see that reductions in total energy use ranging from 11% in the commercial sector to 43% in the residential sector. These reductions would come from a combination of actions to first reduce building energy demand, and second, use cleaner fuels for the building energy still required. In the transportation sector, we see reductions from first building a community that supports less driving, and second, using cleaner fuels for the driving still required. And in the waste sector, we see reductions coming from first producing less waste and diverting the waste that is produced to more productive end uses, and second, managing or cleaning the emissions from the waste that has been produced. Clearly, these textured wedges do not get us to zero by 2030 by themselves. Indeed, that largest greenish blue wedge at the bottom, the wedge without texture, represents the still remaining emissions gap. Indeed, because of our delay to act and invest, it is not feasible to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 with reductions alone, which means that in order to be carbon neutral, we will have to fill this still remaining gap with another portfolio of projects that will achieve what is known as carbon dioxide removal. Essentially, we will have to clean up the pollution that we were unable to avoid spewing. Next slide, please. Now, if the wedge and emissions gap are a bit obtuse, it might be helpful to think about carbon neutrality with the balanced scale metaphor. Again, after reducing our emissions as much as possible over the next 8 years, we will still produce a significant amount of pollution in the year 2030. And so to be carbon neutral, we will first measure the amount of pollution that we still produce. We will put that measurement on the left side of the scale. In order to balance the scale, then, we will need to clean up an equivalent amount of pollution. And again, this is done with carbon dioxide removal initiatives. Finally, you could think of this a little bit like your neighbor's trash can dumped onto your yard every morning. Imagine how bizarre it would be to confront them about it, only to be told that you should be thanking them because they've reduced how much trash they put in the can before dumping it in your yard. Well, the fact is they are still dumping trash into your yard, and if they are incapable of reducing the trash in their can to zero, then the only satisfying outcome would be for them to clean up the pollution that they are still dumping. Next slide, please. All right, so now that I have defined carbon neutrality and illustrated that achieving it will require a combination of pollution reductions and pollution removal, I am going to spend just a few minutes unpacking this graph, which does come from the International Panel on Climate Change report for policymakers. I have added the red lines that are on this graph for emphasis, and I'll start by giving away the 2 punchlines. The first is that the next decade is the critical decade to achieve significant emissions reductions. The second is that reductions alone will not be sufficient, meaning that carbon dioxide removal at scale will be necessary and soon. Diving into the graph, if you look at the horizontal red line, this represents net zero emissions or carbon neutrality now on a global scale. Clearly, we are well above that right now. The leftmost vertical red line represents the year 2030, and the rightmost vertical red line represents the year 2050. This graph plots multiple scenarios that actually succeed in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 Fahrenheit. And as you can see, all scenarios envision the world arriving at net zero emissions sometime around 2050, followed by decades of net negative emissions from continued carbon dioxide removal. If we go back to that trash can analogy, you might tell your neighbor that just picking up today's trash dump isn't sufficient. They also need to pick up yesterday's. Additionally, the exact amount of carbon dioxide removal that will ultimately be required over the next century depends largely on the reductions that are achieved in the next decade. Clearly, the steepest part of these curves occurs between now and 2030. Additionally, the report emphasizes that, quote, delayed actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions include the risks of cost escalation, stranded assets, and reduced flexibility in terms of future response options. These projects and conclusions are why this decade is seen as the critical decade for action. Any further delay and the scenarios for limiting warming to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit simply begin to fall apart, not to mention they become more expensive. The Flagstaff Climate Emergency Declaration recognized these realities, which is why 2030 was selected as the target year for achieving carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. Building further on the global perspective, we have to acknowledge that the world is not going to arrive at net zero emissions by 2050 by having all countries and cities arrive simultaneously. We will not be able to hold hands and watch as we each individually cross that net zero finish line at the exact same moment. The global outcomes needed will always be a game of averages. Therefore, in order for the world to be here at this black dot in 2050, those that can will need to be here at this blue dot. Likewise, in 2030, in order for the world to be here at this black dot, those that can will need to be here at this blue dot. Success on a global scale will require leadership. Leaders will do what is needed first and early. Leaders will willingly pull their fair share and then perhaps more because they can. Leaders will take the necessary actions regardless of what others are doing. Leaders will help others succeed as well as hold them appropriately accountable. The Flagstaff community believes that we can be leaders. It is why our community brought forward the Climate Emergency Declaration. Lessons learned from investing in retirement are yet another reason why this decade is seen as the decade for action. It is said that the best time to start investing for retirement is 15 years ago. The next best time is now. Like retirement, it may be helpful to approach the spending that will be required on climate action with an investment mindset. Investments do require spending, but they also produce returns and benefits. The earlier someone starts investing, the easier and less expensive it will be for them to meet their retirement goals. The longer someone delays, the more difficult and expensive it becomes. Wait too long and retirement might not be an option. Emissions reductions achieved today are like money in the bank that compound over time. Waiting to make the investments to achieve those reductions only means that we get further and further behind, that the task becomes more difficult and expensive, until one day the goal of climate stabilization and harm reduction become unachievable. These graphs drive home this last point. Had we started making investments to achieve reductions 12 years ago, we would have only needed to achieve 3.3% reductions per year in order to achieve climate stabilization and limit harm reduction at 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Due to our collective delay, by 2020, the reduction curve had already become far more steep, requiring an average of 7.6% reductions per year. Every additional delay will mean that the required reductions line gets steeper until one day it becomes vertical and infeasible. Not only is this the decade for investment, frankly, this needs to be the year. Next slide, please. So in summary, why this decade? In order to achieve climate stabilization and limit harm reduction, this decade must be the steepest part of the emissions reduction journey. Gigaton scale carbon removal will be required starting in mid-century, and therefore reductions in removal must be pursued now and simultaneously. Delayed investment in reductions and removal will make both more difficult and more expensive. Next slide, please. And before I hand the presentation over to Jenny Neiman, I do have one new slide that was not provided in your packet ahead of time. We have heard, and not for the first time, that there are some questions about how the $60 million plus bond proposal relates to the price tag of the carbon neutrality plan in total. And while I can't yet answer that question directly, I can try to give some sense of magnitude. We are currently working with a financial analyst consulting group to evaluate the carbon neutrality plan. This is the same group that performed a financial analysis of the A20 carbon neutrality plan developed by the city of Ann Arbor in Michigan. A bit larger than Flagstaff, Ann Arbor is also a college town in a cold climate with roughly 2 to 3 times our own emissions. In that analysis, it was found that the cost to implement the Ann Arbor plan would be a little over $1 billion. Jenny, you can hit the next button. And as previously mentioned, climate plans are quite similar. The recipe is rather prescriptive. We have been working with the consultant group for a few months now on a similar analysis, as it has been a part of the vision for the one-year update to the carbon neutrality plan for a long time now. And while I'm not sure that we'll have the total costs available before our final meeting with this bond committee, we believe that the Ann Arbor analysis gives a sense of scope. Given that their plan is forecast to cost over a little over $1 billion, we should expect that getting to carbon neutrality is going to require multiple hundreds of millions of dollars of investment here in Flagstaff. Indeed, the Active Transportation Management Plan, passage of which is a key action outlined in the carbon neutrality plan, is forecast to require nearly $200 million of investment alone. So we know that the 2022 bond package won't be nearly enough to accomplish all of our goals, but it does get us started. While we will be aggressively pursuing federal funding and other avenues, bond funding has the potential to be the first installment of what will undoubtedly be a much larger investment package. Now, I'm pleased to hand the presentation over to Jenny Neiman.
Thank you so much, Ramon. Ramon is a tough act to follow. If you cannot tell, he is our numbers guy. I am going to take us down into the carbon neutrality plan. So to a local level, to what does this matter? How does this work? What does this mean for Flagstaff? The carbon neutrality plan is the foundation document that guides our bond proposal. This plan was adopted 8 months ago in June 2021. I'm not going to get into every policy of the plan, but rather I will review the target areas of action that the plan identifies. The takeaway is this: there's a very straight line from the principles that Nicole spoke about through the scientific data and urgency that Ramon just reviewed to the carbon neutrality plan. That line then continues from the carbon neutrality plan to our bond proposal. In terms of community conversations, how we built the carbon neutrality plan is just as important as what it says. This plan is rooted in community. It exists due to that citizen petition that Nicole discussed. We worked to get community input throughout the process. The plan was guided by a steering committee, and we utilized surveys, forums, open houses, and community presentations, in addition to a site with about 25 videos created by community and staff. This brought us about 2,600 people into the fold. There are three types of climate action, three main ways to think about climate action. There are fancy names for these actions, but it's actually quite simple. You can find that in the circles here. What's written in those circles are the three ways to act on climate: reducing our impact, preparing for change, and helping out our vulnerable community members. The carbon neutrality plan has three goals. Each speaks to one type of climate action. Those are written outside of each circle. The goal that defines the CMP, its foundation, is mitigation. We have set a goal to reach carbon neutrality by 2030. The two other goals, adaptation and equity, define how we will reach that goal. We will ensure that while we work on mitigation and while we work to get to carbon neutrality, that we're creating a stronger Flagstaff that's both well prepared to adapt to a more volatile future. We'll also ensure that equity is integrated into every action we take. The carbon neutrality plan has 9 target areas. Those are what's in this sort of honeycomb here. We'll need to work across our neighborhoods, our energy sources, our consumption, and our commitment. It will take work across every part of our community. These 9 target areas define the scope of the plan and where we need to focus our work. I'm going to take us briefly through each one of these. First, our neighborhoods. We need to think about how our neighborhoods are designed and how we interact with our neighbors and communities, how our community systems can contribute to our strength. You'll notice that this includes equity and resilience, which are 2 of the main overarching goals that I just talked about. These are 2 target areas that are a little bit special because we intend to incorporate them throughout the plan. The first one, community resilience. This means anticipating needs. This means thinking about how we make our community stronger. We know that climate change is going to cause a lot of change in our community. It's going to increase volatility. It's going to bring long-term changes. So when we think about long-term changes, we think about housing prices or increased visitation in the summer as central and southern Arizona gets much hotter, and how that visitation will affect us. We also think about short-term shocks. So maybe that's flooding, maybe that's a wildfire, right? Those are the short-term. We need to think about both long-term and short-term changes and figure out how we make a more resilient community, how we strengthen our systems. The next is equity. So climate change is a huge concern for the world. One of the fundamental reasons it's a concern is that climate change is going to hit our vulnerable communities first and worst. Climate change is essentially a crisis for the world's poor, right? And that includes our vulnerable neighbors in Flagstaff. So whether that is low-income families, communities of color, et cetera, right? And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that we are ensuring that when we act, that we are not harming any communities further, and also that we make sure that everyone has access to these actions, to the benefits of climate actions. We need to serve vulnerable communities first. So this is targeted universalism. How do we serve vulnerable community members first with all of our programming? Then that will serve the whole community. We also need to recognize past harms and build relationships. Decreased dependence on cars. So this one is a really meaty target area for good reason. It involves rethinking the way we plan our transportation systems and the way that we plan our neighborhoods. Right now, we're pretty dependent on cars, but we know that many people in many cities can be less dependent on vehicles to get around. So what we want to do is change our transportation planning and policies, as well as change our land use so that more people have the freedom to get around town without a car if they are able and if they want to make that choice. The next is our energy sources. So this is thinking about where our energy comes from and how we use it. First is electric mobility. So there's a lot of talk around electric vehicles, right? We often talk about EVs, but again, because we want to depend less on cars, what we want to do first is prioritize electric buses. Mountain Line is already starting to work on this, our transit provider. We want to work on electric mobility. Electric mobility means any small device that's electric and powered and helps folks get around town. You might see scooters or one wheels or hoverboards around your neighborhood. People use those because they're cheap and they're convenient and maybe even fun. Finally, we want to help facilitate the transition to electric vehicles. The market is going to do much of this. It's going to move very quickly. What we want to do is get out of the way in a lot of ways, right? We also really want to think about charging. We want folks to be able to charge where they live, where they work, where they need charging so that they can get around. Next is clean electricity. This is pretty standard climate action. We want to obtain as much of our electricity from clean sources as possible. Electricity is really wonderful because it has the ability to get cleaner over time. Solar is now the least expensive source of electricity in history, and our grid will begin to shift rapidly. So first, we're going to think about renewable electricity for all city needs. Then we're going to think about solar on new buildings. Then we're going to think about solar on existing homes and businesses. Next is building fuel switching. We currently use natural gas in many of our homes and businesses. Natural gas and really any fossil fuel is what we want to move away from. We want to move away from fossil fuels to using electricity in our buildings. Again, this is mainly natural gas and propane, which are non-renewable resources with very significant emissions as well as health impacts. And so we want to remove natural gas uses in municipal buildings. We want to encourage electrification in new buildings as well as existing homes and businesses. We also know we're going to need to do a lot of training and workforce development to help our workforce take advantage of this. Next, this is about our consumption. So first, when we think about our consumption, we think about the energy that we use in our buildings. Energy efficiency is one of the best climate actions. Everybody supports it and you get a great return on investment. First, we want to think about energy efficiency and reducing energy use in our city facilities. Then we want to think about our new homes, and then we want to think about our existing buildings. Finally, sustainable consumption and waste management. What we consume matters. It has a lot of impact. And so we want to help folks consume more sustainably. We have a lot of emissions that come from our landfill. This is primarily due to organic waste going to the landfill. And so we want to divert organic waste to the landfill. We want to divert that to feeding people in need. We have a lot of food waste in our country. Up to 40% of food is wasted. So we really want to work on that. We also want to divert all kinds of waste, recycle as we can, etc. Finally, carbon dioxide removal is key to carbon neutrality. This is about holding up that commitment. And so first, we're going to reduce as much as we can. That's the first part of the wedge that DC talked about. We're going to follow that up with removing carbon dioxide. We're going to do this, we hope, through regional and local projects. We're working today to actually develop the CDR market in Flagstaff and really get some innovation in Flagstaff and drive that industry. If that's not sufficient, then we'll go into offsets. We wanted to show here, we have started we've been working the last 8 months to begin implementation in each of these 9 target areas. The good news is that we're beginning work across the plan. The bad news is that with our current budget, we're really working on the margins in some ways, but we are working to make sure that we are shovel ready, right? When we are able to get funding, that is, whether that's federal funding, whether that's partnership funding, whether that's funding through this bond. And so we're building the base for this work throughout all of these sections of our work, and really hope to be starting this sort of transformation of our community systems that we need to see. So this is really just to say we're trying to lay the groundwork right now. Finally, I want to just end, the best thing about climate action and the thing that drives me is not emission reductions. It is that climate action can lead to a better community. It can lead to a more livable community, a happier community, even a healthier community. The science is there. There is return on investment for all of this. The benefits are huge. We've just got to figure out how to make the investments that can bring us into this more sustainable, but again, a healthier and a more livable future. So thank you to the committee so very much, and I'm very happy to hand this over to Nicole.
Great, thank you, Jenny. I think I might actually have video, so hopefully I can actually see the presentation and hear everyone just fine. So thank you so much, Jenny. Committee members, before we shift the conversation to the Climate Action Bond framework, I want to provide context to why we are pursuing a bond to fund climate action. Some may not be aware that Arizona was once a leader in climate action. This started back in the year 2005 with Arizona's leadership. They wanted to address climate change, passing executive orders and planning for statewide climate action, as well as adoption of clean car standards and so forth. However, starting in 2010, Arizona began passing legislation and executive orders that hindered climate action, not only at the state level, but at the local level. And this is just an example of some of the challenges that we are facing in terms of taking climate action. Next slide. Arizona's cities and counties have taken the lead on climate action in the absence of state leadership. They've also taken the lead because they are the branch of government that are the closest to our community. And they are also the first responders to the impacts of climate change. Cities and counties are also hit harder and faster by these impacts. In addition, we currently have no legal mechanism to establish a climate action tax, let's say like that of the BBB, or a climate action fee, say example being a building permit application fee. That's why we are looking to a climate action bond. I promise I'm almost to the bond package, but I want to use this slide to offer comfort in the fact that we've been talking about climate action in Flagstaff for years, but we've never systematically funded implementation. For example, the 2014 regional plan that was ratified by voters has climate change and adaptation goals and policies. Goals include reducing greenhouse gas emissions, strengthening community and natural environment resiliency through climate adaptation efforts, and integrating available science into policies governing the use and conservation of Flagstaff natural resources. To respond to needs and commitments many community members have asked for and the City Council has set, we need sustained funding that goes well beyond the city's current investment. Current funding is too limited and capped. So for example, the city's climate action base budget doesn't even begin to move the needle in the work that needs to be done. This year's base budget, for example, is $100,000. But please keep in mind that there are various city projects throughout the organization that have funding for programming, maybe one-time funding or maybe ongoing, that is allocated each year. For example, last budget year, we were still operating under the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan as the carbon neutrality plan hadn't been passed. But $195,000 one-time funds went toward waste minimization programming, and almost $640,000 went toward economic prosperity and recreation. As the city shifts to performance-based budgeting, we will begin to have a much better understanding of how much we as a city organization are truly investing in climate action. And of course, there's significant alignment across the city organization, especially with the work in resiliency. And I know you heard a lot about this already, but for example, all the work that's being done in stormwater and wastewater. There's work being done in mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. For example, all the work that's being done by our facilities team, as well as equity. And you heard a lot about that over the last 2 weeks when we were talking with the housing staff. So all funding opportunities need to be on deck. Ramon mentioned this earlier, but we will need to lean on local, federal, and private funding to really move the needle and achieve the goals of carbon neutrality. All right, hopefully we've effectively set the stage, so let's talk climate action bond. Our goal for the bond as we were developing this proposal is to invest in our community, our homes, our energy, and our mobility to create a more connected, healthy, and livable Flagstaff. This framework is designed so we can be leaders, we can bring many resources, much needed resources to the community. We can balance tensions and create solutions and opportunities. We can center programming around equity and adaptation and design programming for impactful long-term community benefit. Our philosophy in developing this proposal is that this package is rooted in community and providing those needed resources in the most equitable manner. We also want to openly acknowledge that there will be tensions and that we must avoid adding new burdens. A timely example is achieving both home electrification and affordable living. This will require that we focus on creative, person-focused solutions that help solve both challenges. Last piece of housekeeping. We will review 3 bond packages with you today. For each package, there are 2 to 3 elements Each element has 3 slides, an introduction slide, a co-benefit slide, which notes alignment with the carbon neutrality plan, and we will use icons on the screen representing by weight of impact: workforce development, local economy, air quality, public health, cost savings to Flagstaff residents, and ability to leverage with federal funding. The final slide identifies impacts. All right, let's jump in. So the first package is healthy and affordable homes. The second package is energy independence and resilience. And the third package is community mobility. Broken down, all 3 packages total $67,750,000. That's even hard to say. The 3 packages before you this afternoon are the best of what's possible to jumpstart our path to carbon neutrality. The elements of these projects are impactful, they're driven by data and the community's voice. Now, we wanted to provide the committee with a broad menu of impactful actions to choose from. With this in mind, at the end of the presentation, I will present staff's recommendation for 2 additional options that actually package the climate action bond in a $30 million construct and a $20 million construct. All right, let's dive into the healthy and affordable homes package and its 3 elements. The goal for the efficient home element is to increase home health, safety, affordability, and energy efficiency. This will be done through deep energy efficiency home retrofits, energy rebate program expansion, assisted loan program. This is a smart e-loan guarantee and interest buy-down program, and weatherization and energy efficiency workforce development. This element supports numerous strategies in the carbon neutrality plan and has cost savings to Flagstaff residents, supports the local economy, supports workforce development, and can be leveraged with federal funding. At $15.5 million, we would be able to conduct 500 deep energy efficient retrofits, 2,000 households would receive home upgrade rebates, 3,000 households could utilize subsidized loans to support energy investment and renewable energy investment. This would serve 5,500 households with a total emissions reduction in 2030 of 5,400 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Moving on, the goal for the Healthy Homes element is to improve air quality in homes and neighborhoods through wood stove rebates and air filtration systems. Wood stove rebates would be provided to residents who purchase a new EPA certified wood stove. These stoves are 33% more energy efficient, requiring less wood for the same amount of heat, and improve air quality in both the residential structure as well as in the neighborhood. This rebate would complement an existing federal rebate leveraging program. The next part of this element is a HEPA air filtration program. This would provide air purification HEPA systems to vulnerable residents in our community. These filters assist residents on unhealthy air days, which are becoming more and more frequent in our community. This element supports community resilience and equitable systems in the carbon neutrality plan and has co-benefits of public health, air quality, cost savings to Flagstaff residents, and can be leveraged with federal funding as well as supporting workforce development. At a little over $1 million, the Healthy Homes program could help 1,500 residents purchase a new EPA stove, and 15,000 households would receive air filtration. I just said 15,000. I apologize. 1,500 households would receive air filtration systems and can breathe easier on poor air quality days. The total emissions reduced in 2030 would be 900 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. The goal for the accessory dwelling unit infill accelerator is to increase efficient and affordable housing availability in existing neighborhoods. The accelerator would usher in 200 rental units by incentivizing accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, in existing neighborhoods. Incentives will be provided for ADUs built with a commitment to provide affordable and efficient rental housing for a set duration of time. ADUs built to provide affordable rent for a set duration will receive a $7,500 incentive. And units that are built to be all electric will receive that incentive and pre-approved architectural plan sets to choose from. This element supports equitable systems and decreased dependence on cars in the carbon neutrality plan, and has the co-benefits of cost savings to Flagstaff residents. It supports the local economy as well as workforce development. At $1.5 million, these incentives can catalyze an additional 200 rental units in existing transit-accessible neighborhoods. This element would reduce more than 1,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. The next package is the Energy Independence and Resilience Package. The goal for the renewable and efficient city facilities is to conserve energy and utilize clean energy at city facilities. This will be done through two parts. The first is large-scale renewable energy project development and the purchase of clean energy offsets for municipal needs, as well as City of Flagstaff energy efficiency upgrades. Clean energy projects would provide 100% clean energy to all City of Flagstaff facilities, including wastewater and water production. The second part of this, energy efficiency upgrades at City of Flagstaff municipal facilities, these upgrades will reduce the city's natural gas usage and reduce overall energy use and reduce costs at City of Flagstaff facilities. This element supports community resilience, clean electricity, and building fuel switching in the carbon neutrality plan, and has the co-benefits of public health and indoor air quality improvements. At $10 million, this element will stabilize municipal energy expenditures, will improve facilities efficiencies, and create redundant systems to support the community. The city will electrify by replacing natural gas combustion with electric infrastructure, resulting in better indoor air quality, reduced costs, and reduced emissions. This effort would offset and reduce more than 18,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. The goal of the Resilience Hubs element is to increase community self-reliance, focusing on emergency response facilities and community-based hubs. The first part of this effort will develop energy redundant systems at emergency response facilities and community resiliency hub locations. For emergency facilities, solar and battery microgrid projects will improve the resilience at water services, operational facilities, emergency response facilities such as police department and fire department, and the Flagstaff Airport. The microgrids or redundancy loops will enable facilities to operate through a power outage, enhancing emergency response and community services during crisis situations. The community resilience hubs will be neighborhood-based and community-driven. Can we go back a slide? Thank you. Neighborhood-driven, providing refuge and resources in emergencies big and small. And this would be a response to an increase in extreme weather, emergency, and smoke events. The hubs would include enhanced air filtering, power during outages, and emergency resources. Okay, let's go to that slide. Wonderful. This element supports numerous strategies in the carbon neutrality plan and supports public health, improves air quality, and can be leveraged with federal funding. At $8 million, this element will augment community serving facilities to support residents and distribute resources to enhance the quality of life. Our emergency response facilities will have redundant systems and would be able to provide energy and enable the city to provide needed resources in emergency conditions. All right. The community mobility package has 2 elements. The goal of the safe and accessible bike and pedestrian infrastructure element is to provide safe, comfortable, and attractive ways for all Flagstaff residents to walk, bike, and roll. At $30 million, we would implement critical bike and pedestrian infrastructure upgrades to create a safer walking and biking environment in Flagstaff and accelerate the active transportation management plan, which is currently in draft format, but will be before council in the coming months. Flagstaff has millions of dollars in unmet bike and pedestrian needs, including primary bikeways, major foot trails, pedestrian crossings, and protected bike lanes. This element supports community resilience, equitable systems, and decreased dependence on cars in the carbon neutrality plan, and supports all the co-benefits that were listed earlier. Impacts associated with this element include making affordable transportation infrastructure options and also making pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure more comfortable, convenient, and useful. The total emission reductions is just about 4,300 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. All right, the final element is community electric transportation. The goal of this element is to provide more affordable and efficient transportation options to all residents. This 2-part effort would launch a bike share program in Flagstaff to provide affordable and convenient transportation options to the community and to our visitors. It would be operated by the city, and the system will emphasize underserved neighborhoods and subsidize memberships for low-income residents. Bike share can reduce reliance on cars and complement transit and help manage congestion. Part 2 would provide electric car share at Flagstaff Housing Authority sites to reduce car dependence and living expenses and increase mobility. 2 cars would be available per site. This element aligns with the carbon neutrality plan in numerous ways and supports all but one co-benefit, as we have not seen as of yet any opportunity to leverage federal funding, but we are definitely keeping our eye on it. At $1.7 million, this element would infuse affordable and accessible clean transportation options into the community. It would help reduce dependence on cars with a key focus on low-income community members. The total emissions reduced by 2030 would be 454 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Community members, at the end of the day, this is about our community members, our homes, how we power our city, and how we get around town. As mentioned earlier, we know that what we've presented you today is well beyond the city's bond threshold, especially in consideration of all the needs that we have, not only for our infrastructure, but for our community members. We did want to offer you a robust menu of impactful actions throughout the elements that were presented. With this in mind, though, we have worked diligently to provide recommended package options to the committee. We have 2 that are listed on the screen. Option 2 is a $30 million package, which you can see in the 5th column. And in the 6th column is a $20 million option. This table represents the impact analysis associated with each option. We are happy to provide more detailed impact analysis that you saw earlier with those 3 slides at our meeting next week. But we felt, for the sake of time and the amount of information that we have provided you today, this would be a good point to stop and answer any questions, which I'm assuming there probably will be a fair amount that the committee may have. So, committee members, thank you so much. We know that that was a lot of information, but we look forward to having a dialogue with you.
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Angelopoulos and your team, Ramon and Jenny. Very good presentation. So as you mentioned, at this time for the committee to ask questions, we do have another almost a half an hour for questions. And then also next week meeting, there is time dedicated to do more questions or follow-up questions of that nature. And so with that, I guess I'll turn it into the committee to ask their questions. So thank you. All right. First one with a hand raised is committee member Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation as well. Just sort of a general question on all of the programs where you cited that there's the opportunity to leverage the funds with federal money. Do you have a rough idea of what that translates to? Like, is it a 1-to-1 ratio? Is it for every dollar we put in, we get $3 back in federal funding, or what? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but just a rough idea of what the benefit is there.
I wish I had a very thorough answer for that question. We are still learning more every day about the federal funding opportunities. My understanding, and I by no means am an expert, but would be happy to follow up over the course of the next week with the city staff that are definitely more knowledgeable than I am and have been keeping a pulse on it. We do know that federal funding will be coming through various agencies within the federal government. Some funding will be coming directly to states and some will be coming directly to jurisdictions. So I don't have a good pulse on that just yet, but I will be happy to let you know what I can find out over the course of the next week before we return to the committee next Thursday.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks.
I think one of us committee members had asked, perfect, I just see it. Thank you, Ginny. And then Mr. Dominguez, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks to the staff members. I do have a question about the neighborhood revitalization. What exactly and how is that going to be done? I know that I've had people that have talked to me about, hey, I went in there for a rebate and they're out of money. And it seems like there always not enough money, which I know that's always the case. But I just wonder, is there a fair and, we don't want the contractors coming in here and putting all these new toilets in the rehab, and then the mom and pops don't get a chance. And so I just want to see how that's going to be working, because I just like to see how that's going to be planned out. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I just want to clarify, you were speaking, Mr. Dominguez, about the retrofits and rebate programs that we currently have and that we have proposed.
Yes. Like I said, I just want to make sure that everybody has a fair shot at it. A lot of times people don't know about it until it's too late. And so to me, it was just, if we want to sell something like this, of course, education is always the key. But on some of the older communities, there's other issues that go along with the retrofitting or energy saving techniques. Some of these houses are 100 years old. And so, the toilet's the easy one. It's the rest of the stuff that I worry about.
And if I'd like to ask Ramon to jump in, but and thank you for bringing this up because it's a really important discussion point. And one of the slides from our climate action history, there was a bullet that did mention that back during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we were able to receive just about $600,000 from the federal government to launch through the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant to launch a deep retrofit program in our community. And we learned a ton. And we really focused on a comprehensive package that not only, fortunately, we went through the official procurement process. We were able to hire 2 local businesses to conduct all of the work. And by no means is that a promise. We do have to follow Arizona procurement laws. But They won in a competitive bid, but we also built into it workforce development and training and workforce development for youth. So we have a lot of great lessons learned from that program, and just to toot a horn, we actually were received an award from the federal government for that framework of that program, because it was so rich across all of these elements. But I would like to ask Ramon to talk about some of the work we're actually doing right now that we would just accelerate and use as a foundation if we were to successfully address or allocate more money.
Sure. Thank you, Nicole. And thanks for your comments, committee member. Speaking about our current energy rebate program, you're right. We are able to distribute all of the funds very quickly, and frankly, we don't try very hard. Our current budget is $20,000 per year, and we're usually exhausted by December. This year I made efforts to get the word out in July when the new fiscal year began. I had an opportunity to be on Sunnyside Radio, and we had some social media campaigns and things to try to let people know about the program. We also made a couple of tweaks to the program this year, hoping to be able to have an impact on the equity sort of piece. We had this income qualified rebate supplement where we would be able to give a little bit more of a rebate. We found that actually did not get taken up, and part of it is just the structure of rebates can often be just still difficult for people to access. You still need the upfront capital. So within the rebate sort of structure, we're also very interested in pursuing prebates and essentially offering the contractors the rebates if they give the resident the sort of rebate amount up front. So that would just lower barriers for people with lower incomes to be able to take advantage of the system without necessarily needing as much upfront capital. So there are definitely strategies and mechanisms that we're excited to use. And you can see that sort of that difference between $20,000 a year and perhaps something that's in the $1 million+ range would really just give us an opportunity to sort of run the program a little bit differently and be able to actually use some energy to get the word out there. Because like I said, right now, it does all get kind of gobbled up without all that much effort on our part to get the word out about the program.
All right. Thank you, Ramon. And go to our next committee member. I'm going to go with the hand raise for the moment in case we don't get to everyone's questions, and then at least they're printed and we can answer them if we run out of time. Mr. Ghetto.
Thanks, Chair Odegaard. And thank you for that excellent presentation. Just another enormous task in front of you. To get to carbon neutrality, and I hope you succeed. Just a couple of things. I think it would be helpful if in the next presentation you were able to display what the cost is per metric ton in savings, right? A lot of different programs have a lot of different price tags and a lot of different savings. It would be nice to see where we get the most bang for our buck, and whether or not you're considering that too in options 3, which I assume is where we want to get a lot of bang for our buck. So I would just recommend that as a helpful piece of advice. I'll just say, on a personal note, I am right now 10 months into a 6-month renovation. And I am putting in every major energy efficient piece of equipment possible. Maybe it's just me. I didn't even consider rebates. It's just smart business to put in efficient things when you're retrofitting a home. I guess my question really is, it started with 3,500 community members having input into and as well as unanimous city council confidence in getting to carbon neutrality, which, if I was hearing it correctly, could cost upwards of $1 billion if we use another community as a model. We're not aspiring for that, but that's a big price tag. My question, therefore, becomes whether or not 3,500 individuals, I think it was 3,500, is like statistically significant for us to all march in this enormously expensive and really challenging and hurried in goal. So that's what it comes down to, the 3,500, and if that's right or not. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. We will pull information in. And Jenny, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. Thank you so much for that question, committee member Ghetto. And I'm excited to hear about your renovation. And you're right. A lot of this is already built in on the financial standpoint. To your point about community members, absolutely, right? That is not all 70,000 people of Flagstaff. We feel strongly that that's a really strong number, right? We feel that that is, pretty representative of folks. We do have some data on this. So we're very lucky. Metro Plan, our partner, recently did a survey. They did a statistically valid survey. We did not do that as part of our work, but they did a statistically valid survey of the Flagstaff community. They asked about climate change. They said, is this happening? The above 90% said yes. And then that's, we're very established in that fact. More importantly, they said, do you support climate action? And we got a 75% percentage of the community, right? And they didn't say, levels of community action, but we know there's really strong support for climate action. We also know, and we're really encouraged by, pretty much whenever the city goes out to talk to the community, right? There are climate actions, housing is climate action, right? There are so many different ways of climate action, and we continue to see support for this over and over and over. It's really well-rounded across many of the city's initiatives that this is where the public wants to go.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next with the hand raise is Miss McLaughlin.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the presentation and the detailed information. I'm wondering about the specific recommendations for bond funding. Is that coming from the Sustainability Commission? Is it coming from staff? Who's making these recommendations?
Thank you, committee member. That is a fantastic question. So kind of built into the space that this is a very prescriptive plan because it's based on data points and modeling associated with specific actions. This plan was developed in association with consultants, technical consultants, and then we took that information and went to the community to get the Flagstaff flavor on how we can actually achieve the goals of the carbon neutrality plan and what's right for Flagstaff. With that in mind, that's how the carbon neutrality plan was developed in a nutshell. I'm oversimplifying it, I know, but for the sake of time. And then with that, we built the proposed bond package looking at the city's threshold. We brought the Sustainability Commission in as an overarching kind of thumbs up, but we really focused on the data points and, again, the very prescriptive nature of climate action. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Before I move on to the next hand raise, a follow-up with that, since the Sustainability Commission saw it, and is there, do we have anybody from the commission with us today that maybe could provide some background information to the committee members of what they saw and what was there any decision making from the commission?
I believe we have Commissioner John Daly.
Okay,
that
would be great if Mr. Daly could provide us with any information.
Sure. Yeah, so, there wasn't a formal, up-down vote on each of these items by the Sustainability Commission. We did review I guess the listing of items, which has evolved a little bit over the ongoing weeks, but at least my recollection is there was not no stones were thrown at the proposal, if you will. And I think we're generally in agreement with staff's recommendations for kind of a good listing of items to bring to the bond committee.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Daly, and thank you for also being on the committee, helpful with this topic. And so the next hand raise I saw was Mr. Byer.
Thank you. I had a few comments. This is very exciting, something I've been interested in for a long time. I agree with the previous person, I'm sorry, I forget who it was, who said that most energy efficiency measures just make economic sense. I recently put on a rooftop solar system on my home. I calculate I'm going to get a 12% return on investment. Slam dunk, do it. But what I'd like to do is take some more steps, and I've researched them. I'd like to convert away from gas home furnace, gas water heat, a gas range. But to do that, it's going to cost me $10,000 to have APS upgrade my electric amperage and put in a new box. So I don't know if there's some way to, the city might help leverage, reduce that cost for us, maybe not by a direct subsidy, but by I'll bet there are a few hundred homeowners who would like to, if we could collectively form a cooperative to do that step and enable us to do cool things, asking for no real money, but trying to defray that cost. Maybe I'll let, I can see DC is ready to talk. Ramon, so go ahead, and I do have another question.
Sure. I just want to let you know, I've heard that same story from many other interested early adopters who are raising their hand and saying they want to go the electrification route. I've had conversations with APS, and they've largely indicated that upgrades to get people to 200 amp service is something that they would support. Some of the 400 amp service that can be come on the table when bringing on hot tubs and electric vehicles and some other things can be a difficulty. I'll just mention that we know of multiple installations, heat pump installations in town that have been able to do it on 200 amp service. And so part of it also is having those conversations even with contractors and others, figure out the amp service. We actually did include an amp or a service panel upgrade as a piece of the rebate program this last year, and would be interested in being able to kind of roll that into some of the rebates or assisted loading programs that we're proposing as well. We do know that in order to electrify, we're going to need to improve our electrical infrastructure. Those two things have to happen simultaneously, and of course APS is going to be a partner in that. And so we're continuing to have conversations to try to just grease the skids a little bit to make it so that those early adopters don't run into quite so many barriers.
Okay, cool. And then also someone else mentioned the cost per ton, and I did the little math myself, and it looks like the crude is around $2,000 per metric ton, but these projects last for decades. So please break that down for tons over years, then the cost comes way down probably to $10 a ton or something that would be much more sellable to people. So that was the cost in 2030 for 1 year, whereas we're going to get that every year for, forever, for a very long time. Yeah, so, and then I guess the biggest wedge, my third and last comment here will be, the biggest wedge in terms of getting to carbon neutral is that offsets, carbon storage. And there's nothing in here on that topic, and I can see that might be wise actually, because it is so uncertain and risky. Every 3 years, I calculate all my air travel and buy offsets, and every time I buy one, I think, how the hell do I know that this is really going to happen? They say they're reforesting. Is it going to be there, get burned down and not work? But I guess maybe just as we market this to the community, if we could have some way to talk about carbon storage and how what our strategies might be, even if we're not going to put it in. I'm not proposing we put it in the November election, but long term, we need to start thinking about that. And I'm a big favor. So I go to a group called the Climate Community and Biodiversity Alliance, which certifies projects as serving both carbon storage, community benefits, and biodiversity promotion. So I like to feel like my dollars are going good ways. So I'm sure you're thinking about that, but maybe if you could give us some thought, and then as we move forward, give us some materials we can use as we're trying to sell this to the rest of the community. I'll close my microphone and listen.
Thank you, Committee Member Byer. Ramon, would you like to just briefly, I know we only have a couple more moments, just touch base on the carbon dioxide removal and technology that's currently evolving?
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right that we have not put carbon dioxide removal in this bond package. It's definitely something that we're moving forward with and trying to figure out just interesting and innovative ways to be able to collaborate with other local governments. For example, we've had regular conversations with Boulder County and are exploring options for creating coalitions and things of that nature. So we are sort of building the foundation in terms of figuring out the like emerging opportunities in the carbon dioxide space. But I know that Jenny used the term shovel ready. I don't know that we are shovel ready on any carbon dioxide removal project this bond funding cycle. Perhaps in a future one, it will appear, but at the moment we're doing a lot of the groundwork and getting education out into the community. We're currently doing the Innovate Waste and Carbon Neutrality Challenge this year. It's sort of a Shark Tank style event and trying to offer some prize money for entrepreneurs and businesses to think about getting into the carbon removal space, because as some insurance giant has recently said, if it takes $1 trillion industry to put all of those emissions in the air, it'll be the next $1 trillion industry to remove all of it. So those are some of the active conversations we're having in the community, but in terms of it being shovel ready for a bond project this cycle, we decided that that was not the case.
Okay, thank you, Ramon. With that, we're at 5:28, and we want to be cognizant of everyone's time. And before I was going to turn over to Vice Chair White for any comments. Let me go to Mr. Clifton, City Manager.
Thank you, Chair. And I was going to suggest that next week, and thank you to the presenters for getting us through a large volume of material and making it so interesting. Very nice presentation. There will obviously be some continued Q&A next week, and people will probably be thinking of questions between now and then. Shannon has mentioned that she will attempt to corral everything that's been stated in the questions that have been posed in the chat, and we'll have answers for those to start the discussion next week. And we'll continue the Q&A discussion in this very important dialogue. It occurs to me, Chair Odegaard, that we may have some extra time next week, so we will endeavor to have an agenda put together for you that makes it a very meaningful meeting. If we have opportunity to conclude this particular dialogue and start with other discussions, we'll do that. We'll convene with our consultants and we'll put together an agenda that makes use of everybody's time. So I don't want anybody to worry about, well, what if we conclude and we have nothing to talk about? We will make sure that it's a meaningful meeting next week. And I also think that Shannon has already started putting together the dates for the wastewater and treatment facilities at the end of March. So thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, Mr. Clifton. We're here to work, and we've given our time. Again, I really just want to thank all the committee members for their time. Like I said, for every Thursday, basically before the holidays. So before I go, and again, thank you to the presenters. Very good presentation. And I always like to close out with the Vice Chair if he has any comments before we go. So Vice Chair White.
Thanks, Chair Odegaard. I appreciate the opportunity. I don't really have a whole lot to say on this one today. I see in all of the climate emergencies, and frankly, the observation that was made, the best time to have done this was 15 years ago. The second best time is right now, is of course very true. And I see the urgency growing more and more as time goes by, and the money isn't available to do as much as we would love to do. So I'm going to have to say that that part of me regrets that when I was on the council, where I didn't do more in the regulatory arena. I think that's necessary. I've put in the chat to bring up the state restriction slide, and hopefully we can get to that next week. I just see prevention being so much better than retrofitting in all situations where we try to rectify the evils of the past. And I'm going to close with that thought for the committee to kind of look at our recommendations to council too, since once again, we have so much more money in need than we have available. So with that, I'll let it go. I really appreciate Nicole. I always have, and your new team. We've been working on sustainability since we changed clean and green to sustainability, and that was a brand new commission, and I was the council guy, and we tried then to get what we're trying to do now.
Exactly.
And so, you know, I don't know what the population will bear, but I look forward to next week as well. Thanks. Thank you, Charlie.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Vice Chair White. And again, we're going to capture everybody's questions next in the chat box that we see. We'll get them all answered next week. I even have some questions that I have written down that we'll get to next week of my ask of those questions. And so with that, appreciate everybody's time again. I really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody next Thursday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a very nice evening.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Charlie, it's nice to see you.